on the edge of the known world, two of Britain's finest warships vanished into the ice. Erebus and Terror, names that would prove all too fitting. For years, not a word came back. Families waited, rumors spread, and the Arctic itself seemed to have swallowed Franklin and his men whole. But the truth did not stay buried. It leaked out in whispers, shallow graves in the permafrost, journals that ended mid-sentence, bones that told stories no one wanted to believe. But even then, the full truth of the Franklin expedition remained buried in ice. What happened to Franklin's 129 men? Did they starve? Did they turn on each other? Or was something even stranger waiting out there in the endless night? This is the story of the Franklin expedition, and why, nearly 2 centuries later, its frozen dead still speak.
Every second counts, frosted breath in the catacombs. Every step a chess piece moved, shadow plays in a game of gloom.
May 19th, 1845, Greenhithe, England. The River Thames is choked with vessels, but all eyes are on 2 ships that represent the absolute pinnacle of British naval technology. HMS Erebus, 370 tons of reinforced hull and advanced machinery. HMS Terror, her sister ship at 325 tons, equally formidable. Their names translate to darkness and fear. The Admiralty apparently didn't believe in tempting fate. These weren't ordinary vessels. They'd already proven themselves in the Antarctic under James Clark Ross, spending 4 years in the southern ice. Now, refitted with technology that seemed almost magical to the average sailor, they were floating fortresses of the Industrial Revolution. Railway locomotive engines, complete engines lifted from the London and Croydon Railway, had been installed below decks. These could drive the ships at 4 knots through ice that would trap any sailing vessel. Iron plating reinforced their bows until they were battering rams. Internal steam heating systems would keep the crews warm through the polar night. Desalination systems would provide fresh water. The provisions manifest reads like a Victorian fantasy of abundance. 32,000 pounds of beef, 36,000 pounds of biscuit, 3,600 gallons of spirits, 4,500 gallons of ale and porter, and most importantly, 8,000 tins of preserved food, enough to keep the expedition fed for 3 years, with the ability to stretch to 5 if needed. The man chosen to command this technological marvel walked slowly up the gangway. Sir John Franklin, 59 years old, portly, moving with the careful dignity of a man who knows his reputation precedes him. Franklin was already famous, though not entirely for the right reasons. His 1819 to 1822 overland expedition to map the Canadian Arctic coast had gone so catastrophically wrong that 11 of his 20 men died. The survivors had been reduced to eating lichen scraped from rocks, boiled leather from their equipment, and eventually their own boots. The British press, with their peculiar talent for turning disaster into heroism, had christened him the man who ate his boots. But Franklin had spent the decades since rebuilding his reputation. He'd governed Van Diemen's Land, modern Tasmania, where he'd tried to reform the brutal penal colony system. He was deeply religious, beloved by his men, a fellow of the Royal Society. He was also the Admiralty's 3rd choice to lead this expedition. The first choice had been James Clark Ross, who'd conquered the Antarctic. But Ross had promised his wife he'd never winter in the ice again. The second choice was James Fitzjames, but at 32, he was deemed too young for overall command, which brought them to Franklin, aging, eager to redeem his Arctic reputation, willing to sail back into the white hell that had nearly destroyed him once before. Yet the real Arctic expert wasn't Franklin at all. It was Captain Francis Crozier, standing on the deck of Terror. Crozier was 48, from County Down in Ireland. In a Royal Navy dominated by English aristocrats, he was an outsider who'd risen on merit alone. He'd spent his entire adult life in polar waters, 6 Arctic expeditions, 4 years in the Antarctic. He knew ice the way other men knew their wives' faces. Every mood, every danger, every deception. When offered overall command of the expedition, Crozier had refused. Therefore, the fate of 129 men would rest on Franklin's eager but elderly shoulders, with Crozier as his second in command. The Human Manifest tells its own story. Beyond Franklin and Crozier, there was Commander James Fitzjames on Erebus. Young, brilliant, with combat experience in China, but none in ice. There were ice masters who'd spent decades in Greenland whalers, surgeons trained at Edinburgh, Marines for security, and ordinary seamen, some as young as 17, others veterans of Trafalgar. Among them was John Torrington, just 20, from Manchester, a leading stoker whose job was to feed Terror's revolutionary steam engine. There was William Brain, a tough Royal Marine who'd seen combat. John Hartnell, 25, whose brother Thomas was also aboard. 2 brothers seeking adventure together. In their last letters home from Greenhithe, the men revealed glimpses of personality that make their fate all the more haunting. Lieutenant James Walter Fairholme wrote enthusiastically to his father about the ship's pets: Neptune, a massive Newfoundland dog on Erebus, cats for catching rats, and a monkey named Jacko, who was already described as the annoyance and pest of the whole ship, and yet not a person in her would hurt him. Lieutenant Henry Le Vescant assured his mother that the ships were very strong, good ships, and very well provided with everything. Harry Goodsir, the assistant surgeon, wrote excitedly about the scientific work ahead. But one letter stands out. Lieutenant John Irving of Terror wrote what he described as a very serious letter about the long separation ahead, the dangers they faced, hoping for divine protection. Unlike the others' optimism, Irving seemed to sense something darker waiting for them. At Stromness in Scotland, they took on final supplies. In Greenland, 5 men were discharged as unfit for Arctic service, a decision that would save their lives. The expedition now numbered 129 men total, 69 on Erebus under Franklin, 60 on Terror under Crozier. In late July 1845 in Baffin Bay, they encountered their last European witnesses. Captain Danette of the whaler Prince of Wales would later testify, both ships appeared in remarkable trim. The officers were in high spirits, expecting to get through the passage that season. Captain Robert Martin of the Enterprise had dinner with Franklin's officers. They were confident, well supplied, eager to write their names in history. After exchanging pleasantries and mail, the whalers sailed east toward the Greenland fishing grounds. Erebus and Terror sailed west into Lancaster Sound, the eastern entrance to the Northwest Passage. They were never seen alive again. For 3 years, no one in Britain worried. Arctic expeditions routinely lost contact. Pack ice made communication impossible, and 3 years' provisions meant Franklin had no need to hurry. Lady Jane Franklin held dinner parties in London, confident her husband would return trailing glory. The Admiralty assured questioners that the best-equipped expedition in history was in no danger. But in the Arctic, death had already begun its harvest. The expedition had sailed north up Wellington Channel, probing for a passage, before turning south down Peel Sound. By September 1845, they'd established winter quarters at Beechey Island, a desolate gravel spit where they could wait out the months of darkness. And there, in the first winter, Something went wrong. The 3 graves tell the story, but it's what was inside those graves, discovered 140 years later, that would reveal one of several factors in the expedition's doom. Beechy Island, September 1845. As the sun disappeared below the horizon for the last time that year, Franklin's men settled into Arctic routine. The ships were secured against the ice, anchored firm. Snow walls were built around the decks for insulation. The steam heating systems chugged to life, filling the lower decks with warmth. This was what they'd trained for, what the ships were designed for. 3 years in the ice, if necessary. Life aboard followed strict naval routine. Reveille at 6 a.m., even in the 24-hour darkness. Breakfast of burgoo, a porridge of boiled biscuit, with preserved meat. The men were divided into watches, maintaining the ships even though they weren't sailing anywhere. But there was culture too. Both ships had extensive libraries. The officers organized theatrical performances with costumes and scripts they'd brought from England. Someone published a shipboard newspaper. In the evenings, there was music, fiddles, fifes, an accordion. Lessons were organized to teach illiterate sailors to read and write. The officers conducted scientific observations, magnetic readings, weather data, wildlife notes. Hunting parties ventured onto the ice, bringing back seals, Arctic foxes, the occasional polar bear, fresh meat to supplement their preserved stores. But by December, men began falling ill. John Torrington was first, the 20-year-old from Manchester who'd been hired as a leading stoker for Terror's engine. He'd been pale and thin when he joined the expedition. His employer later testified that Torrington had seemed consumptive. Now, in the Arctic darkness, he grew weaker by the day. The ship's surgeon, John Petty, did what he could. But on January 1st, 1846, New Year's Day, John Torrington died. 3 days later, John Hartnell followed. The 25-year-old able seaman had been healthy when they sailed. Now he was dead, leaving his brother Thomas bereft. On April 3rd, William Braine, a tough Royal Marine private, became the third to die. The effort to bury them properly reveals something profound about the expedition's state of mind. The ground on Beechy Island was frozen harder than concrete. It took days of backbreaking labor to chip graves deep enough. The corpses were dressed in their finest clothes, placed in handcrafted mahogany coffins. The headboards were carefully carved, sacred to the memory of John Torrington, who departed this life January 1st, AD 1846, aged 20 years. Sacred to the memory of John Hartnell, AB of HMS Erebus, died January 4th, 1846, aged 25 years. Thus saith the Lord, consider your ways. Yet something was wrong. 3 deaths in the first winter wasn't catastrophic, but the pattern was troubling. Young men, seemingly healthy when they'd sailed, now dead of unclear causes. Petty listed pneumonia and tuberculosis, but these were guesses more than diagnoses. What the expedition didn't know, couldn't know, was that their food supply might be contributing to their problems. Those 8,000 tins of preserved food had been supplied by Stephen Goldner, a provisioner who'd won the contract by promising the lowest price and fastest delivery. He had just 7 weeks to manufacture the entire order. The result was catastrophic corner cutting. The tins were sealed with lead solder, standard for the time, but applied so hastily and heavily that it dripped down the inside of the cans like melted candle wax. Some tins had excess lead pooling in the food itself. Every meal delivered a dose of lead into their systems, but this was just one factor among many that would doom the expedition. The lead weakened their immune systems and clouded their judgment, making them more vulnerable to the Arctic's other killers. Modern researchers debate how significant the lead poisoning was. Some argue it was a primary cause of the expedition's failure. Others see it as one contributing factor among many, the proverbial straw on an already breaking camel's back. As spring 1846 arrived and the ice began to break up, Franklin had a decision to make. June 1846. The ice released its grip on Beechy Island, and Franklin's ships headed south. They were entering waters no European had ever sailed. Peel Sound stretched before them, a channel between Prince of Wales Island and Somerset Island. If they could push through, they'd reach the coast of North America. From there, it was a straight shot west to the Pacific. The steam engines proved their worth, driving the ships through ice that would have stopped pure sailing vessels. When the wind was favorable, they raised sail. When it wasn't, they relied on the railway locomotives churning below decks, burning their precious coal reserves. By August, they'd made remarkable progress. Down through Peel Sound, around the western coast of Somerset Island, then southwest through Franklin Strait. They were approaching King William Island, but Franklin made a crucial decision here, one that would seal their fate. He had two options: east around King William Island, through what would later be called Ray Strait, shallow, rocky, but sometimes ice-free, or west through Victoria Strait, deeper water, better for the ship's draft, but exposed to the full force of polar ice pushed down from the Beaufort Sea. Franklin chose west. By September 1846, they were off the northwest coast of King William Island when the ice closed around them. This wasn't like Beechy Island. This was multi-year pack ice, compressed by enormous pressures into something incredibly hard. It pressed against the ship's hulls with forces that could have crushed unprotected vessels. The iron reinforcement held, but the ships were lifted partially out of the water, heeled over at uncomfortable angles. The steam engines that had been their salvation became useless. You can't ram through ice that thick. September became October. The brief Arctic autumn vanished into winter darkness. The ice didn't release them. The second winter was different. The men maintained their routines: divine service on Sundays, lessons, theatrical performances. But there was an edge now. They'd expected to be through the passage by now, or at least able to retreat if blocked. Instead, they were trapped, and men were getting sick. It started with fatigue that wouldn't go away. Then joint pain, old wounds, cuts that had healed years ago, began to open up. Teeth loosened in men's gums, the classic signs of scurvy. But this made no sense. They had 930 gallons of lemon juice specifically to prevent scurvy. The daily ration was distributed religiously. What they didn't know was that the Admiralty's process for preserving lemon juice, boiling it down and storing it in casks, destroyed nearly all the vitamin C. After a year in storage, they were drinking expensive sugar water while their bodies fell apart from the inside. On May 28, 1847, Lieutenant Graham Gore led a small party ashore on King William Island. They built a stone cairn and deposited a standard Admiralty form in a brass cylinder. These forms were pre-printed with blanks to fill in, routine record-keeping for Arctic expeditions. Gore wrote, 28th of May, 1847, HMS ships Erebus and Terror wintered in the ice in latitude 70 degrees 5 minutes north, longitude 98 degrees 23 minutes west. Having wintered in 1846 to 47 at Beechy Island, Sir John Franklin commanding the expedition. All well, all well. The official report was optimistic. Just 2 weeks later, everything changed. If you're gripped by these true accounts of survival and human endurance from history, make sure to subscribe. We uncover new stories from the past every week. June 11th, 1847. Sir John Franklin died aboard HMS Erebus. He was 61 years old. The cause of death was never recorded. Whether it was stroke, heart attack, or disease, we'll never know. His body was never found, suggesting he was either buried at sea or in a grave on the ice that was subsequently lost. The man who'd eaten his boots to survive had died in a heated cabin, surrounded by tons of food he couldn't digest, leading men he could no longer save. Command passed to Captain Francis Crozier, the ice master who'd turned down leadership, who knew polar conditions better than any man alive. who now held 128 lives in his hands. Summer 1847 came and went. The ice remained solid. For Crozier, the mathematics of survival were becoming brutal. They'd planned for 3 years, could stretch to 5 with reduced rations. They were approaching the end of year 2 with no sign of release. Fuel was running low. The steam engines that heated the ships consumed coal voraciously. Food, while still adequate in quantity, was betraying them in quality. The tinned provisions delivered lead with every meal. The preserved meat lacked essential vitamins, and the anti-scurvy measures weren't working. Through the fall and winter of 1847 to 48, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The coal reserves dwindled, forcing them to ration heating. Men huddled together for warmth. Christmas 1847 passed in near darkness, both from the polar night and the failing oil lamps. By January 1848, men were dying weekly, some from scurvy, others from pneumonia, many from unknown causes. The ship's surgeons were overwhelmed, then sick themselves. Multiple factors were killing them. The lead from the tins accumulated in their bodies, causing neurological symptoms, confusion, fatigue, poor decision-making. Scurvy ravaged them physically. The extreme cold weakened everyone. Tuberculosis and pneumonia spread through the confined spaces. It wasn't one thing killing Franklin's men. It was everything at once. By March 1848, 9 officers and 15 men were dead. Nearly 20% of the expedition. Crozier faced an impossible choice. Stay with the ships and hope for release that seemed increasingly unlikely, or abandon the only shelter they had and attempt to walk to safety. The nearest Hudson's Bay Company outpost was over 1,200 miles away. However, there was a closer possibility. Back's Great Fish River, now the Back River, lay somewhere to the south. If they could reach it, they might follow it inland to find help. The exact distance was unknown, but it meant crossing hundreds of miles of Arctic terrain, which forced Crozier to make the hardest decision of his life. April 22, 1848. After 19 months trapped in the ice, the survivors abandoned HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. They loaded ships' boats onto wooden sledges, massive constructions that would take entire teams to haul. They packed what supplies they could carry, and they prepared for a march that would enter history as one of the most tragic attempts at survival ever recorded. Only then did they realize something was desperately wrong with their judgment. Before leaving, Crozier and Fitzjames returned to the cairn where Gore had left his optimistic message a year earlier. In the margins of the same form, they scrawled an update. April 25, 1848, HM ships, Terror and Erebus, were deserted on the 22nd April 5. The officers and crews consisting of 105 souls under the command of Captain F.R.M. Crozier landed here. Then the crucial information. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847, and the total loss by deaths in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men. They signed it, Crozier and Fitzjames, and added one last line, and start on tomorrow the 26th for Back's Fish River. This single piece of paper would be the only written record ever found from Franklin's expedition after 1845. Every other journal, logbook, and record would vanish. What they didn't write haunts historians. Why did Franklin die? What killed 24 men? Why abandon ships that were still intact, still stocked with supplies? The answer lay in what they chose to take with them. April 26, 1848, King William Island. 105 men set out from the ships, dragging sledges loaded with boats and supplies. The plan was logical. If they reached open water, they'd need the boats. Unfortunately, the physical reality was crushing. The ice was broken into pressure ridges, walls of jumbled blocks that had to be climbed over or chopped through. The extreme cold sapped their strength. Snow blindness struck men who couldn't protect their eyes. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. And this is when the true horror of their mental state became clear. When search parties found their trail years later, the discoveries defied all reason. Among the survival supplies, the dying men had packed silver plate bearing officers' crests, mahogany writing desks, curtain rods, button polish, carpet slippers, silk handkerchiefs, books, novels, religious texts, technical manuals, a clothes brush, officers' dress uniforms, empty tin cans, carefully cleaned and stacked, heavy, useless items that exhausted them faster with every step. Why would dying men carry silverware across the Arctic? Modern researchers suggest several factors were at work. The lead poisoning had affected their judgment, though to what degree remains debated. But beyond that, these items represented their identity as British naval officers. Even in extremis, they clung to the symbols of rank and civilization. The mathematics of their doom were simple. Hauling massive sledges through Arctic pressure ridges, they could manage perhaps a mile or two per day. At that rate, reaching Backsfish River would take months. They had weeks of food at best. By early May, the column had stretched out along the western shore of King William Island. The strongest men forged ahead. The weakest fell behind. Naval discipline, maintained for 3 years, began to crack. Some men simply sat down in the snow and refused to get up. What happened next was witnessed by the only people who truly understood Arctic survival. Inuit families were sealing when they encountered groups of white men dragging sledges across the ice. The men were skeletal, faces blackened by scurvy, barely able to walk. The Inuit tried to communicate, offering seal meat, yet the whites were beyond help. They gestured south, trying to indicate they were heading for the mainland. An Inuit testimony later recorded, "They had once been many, now they were only few." They pointed to the south, and it was understood that they wanted to go home overland. They were not met with again. The death march had fractured. Some groups continued south along King William Island's coast. Others, perhaps realizing the boats were killing them, abandoned the sledges and tried to move faster with just man-hauled packs. One group made it to Todd Island, just off the southern tip of King William Island. Another reached the mainland at a place the Inuit would later call Starvation Cove. Against all logic, the most puzzling discovery would come at Erebus Bay. In 1859, Leopold McClintock's search expedition found a ship's boat from the Franklin expedition, sitting on its sledge as if recently abandoned. Inside were 2 skeletons. One body lay in the bow, still wearing the remains of a steward's uniform. The other, in the stern, had been an officer. Fragments of a silk vest still clung to the bones. What made no sense was the boat's contents. 5 watches, 2 rolls of sheet lead, silk handkerchiefs, silver plate, spoons, forks, teaspoons bearing officers' crests, 26 pieces of silverware in total, books, a copy of The Vicar of Wakefield, soap, sponges, slippers, 7 combs, a clothes brush, and no food. Not a single scrap. Even more bizarre, the boat was pointing north, back toward the ships they'd abandoned. This could only mean these men had given up on reaching safety. In their final delirium, they were trying to return to the vessels they'd abandoned. Near the boat, McClintock's men found more horrors. Scattered bones, some still with flesh attached. The condition of the bones shocked them. Cut marks scarred the surfaces. Some had been split open for marrow. McClintock, a proper Victorian officer, mentioned these details only obliquely in his official report. Nevertheless, his men knew what they'd found. Evidence of the ultimate taboo. The full truth had been known to the Inuit all along. In 1854, Dr. John Ray of the Hudson's Bay Company had been surveying the Boothia Peninsula when he met a group of Inuit with an incredible story. They told him of finding camps of dead white men on King William Island. More disturbing still was what they'd found at the camps. From the mutilated state of many of the corpses, Ray would later write, and the contents of the kettles, it is evident that our wretched countrymen had been driven to the last resource, cannibalism, as a means of prolonging existence. Inuit witnesses described finding bones that showed clear signs of butchering at Starvation Cove on the mainland, the farthest point any survivors reached. The scene was even worse. Bones scattered, evidence of fires, and unmistakable signs that the living had consumed the dead. When Ray reported this to the Admiralty and claimed the 10,000-pound reward for determining the expedition's fate, Victorian England erupted in fury. Lady Jane Franklin, now a widow, launched a vicious public campaign against Ray. How dare this fur trader suggest that officers of the Royal Navy could sink to such depths? She enlisted powerful allies. Charles Dickens, the most famous writer in England, penned a long article in his magazine, Household Words. He called the Inuit testimony the vague babble of savages and wrote, "We believe every savage to be in his heart covetous, treacherous, and cruel, and we have yet to learn what knowledge the white man, lost, houseless, shipless, apparently forgotten by his race, plainly famine-stricken, weak, frozen, helpless, and dying, has of the gentleness of the Eskimo nature. It would take 130 years for science to prove the savages right." In the 1980s and 1990s, forensic anthropologist Dr. Owen Beatty examined bones from King William Island. Under microscopes, the cut marks were unmistakable. Sharp, deliberate incisions where knives had stripped flesh from bone. Some bones showed pot polish from being stirred in cooking vessels. In 1993, Anne Keenly-Side's analysis confirmed that at least 11 individuals showed evidence of cannibalism. The cuts were concentrated on meatier bones, femurs, humeri, exactly where you'd expect if humans were being butchered for food. The most shocking discovery came in September 2024. DNA analysis finally identified one set of remains from King William Island, a jawbone with clear-cut marks showing it had been defleshed. It belonged to James Fitzjames, Captain Franklin's second-in-command on Erebus, the young officer who'd written home about Jacko the monkey. Even the expedition's senior leadership had ended up in the cooking pots. The death sites stretched across King William Island like a grotesque breadcrumb trail. Terror Bay, where desperate men had tried to return to their ship. Erebus Bay, where the boat full of silverware pointed toward futility. Sites across King William Island, where bones from at least 11 men lay scattered. Starvation Cove on the mainland, the farthest anyone made it. At each site, the Inuit found evidence that chilled even hardened Arctic travelers. The Franklin expedition hadn't just failed, it had descended into primal chaos. Back in England, the Franklin expedition's disappearance had become a national obsession. Questions arose, and the Admiralty launched search expeditions. Lady Jane Franklin transformed herself from grieving widow to relentless advocate. She spent her entire fortune funding search expeditions. She wrote letters to anyone with influence, begging for help finding her husband. Between 1848 and 1859, over 30 search expeditions were launched. They came by sea, approaching from both Atlantic and Pacific. They came overland, following the rivers of northern Canada. They offered rewards for finding Franklin alive or determining his fate. These searches had their own disasters. Ships were lost. Men died. The rescue parties needed rescuing themselves. Every expedition searched where British logic dictated. The deep water channels, the northern archipelago, anywhere but where Franklin actually went. Only Dr. John Ray listened to the Inuit, and for that, he was scorned. The closest anyone came to the truth was Francis Leopold McClintock's expedition in 1859, funded by Lady Jane as a final attempt to clear her husband's name. McClintock found the Victory Point note. He found bodies. He found evidence that couldn't be denied. Even so, he downplayed the cannibalism in his official report, focusing instead on British heroism in the face of impossible odds. The official verdict: Franklin had discovered the Northwest Passage. He hadn't. He died miles short. The men had died heroically. There was no conclusive evidence of cannibalism. There was, but admitting it was unthinkable. And so, the truth was buried beneath a century of willful blindness. The real investigation into what killed Franklin's men didn't begin until 1984. Dr. Owen Beatty, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Alberta, had a theory. The scattered bones on King William Island showed clear evidence of scurvy and starvation. What puzzled him was how a well-supplied expedition had deteriorated so quickly. His target: the 3 graves on Beechy Island. Getting permission took years. The graves were in the Canadian Arctic, protected sites. When finally approved, Beatty's team arrived on Beechy Island with ground-penetrating radar, excavation equipment, and a mobile autopsy lab. John Torrington was first. The permafrost had created perfect preservation conditions. When they opened the coffin, Beatty found himself looking at a young man who seemed frozen in time. Torrington's skin was intact, his hair still in place. After 138 years, the detail was extraordinary. The autopsy revealed a young man already dying when he joined the expedition. Tuberculosis scars covered his lungs. He weighed less than 90 pounds. Most shocking were the tissue analysis results. Lead levels in Torrington's tissues were extremely elevated. Hartnell and Brain showed similar patterns. The lead poisoning discovery sparked decades of debate. Initially, researchers thought they'd found the smoking gun, the single cause of the expedition's failure. But modern analysis tells a more complex story. Yes, the lead levels were high, extremely high by today's standards. But were they fatal? That's where the debate begins. Some researchers argue the lead was the primary killer, causing the neurological symptoms that led to poor decisions and the eventual cannibalism. Others see it as one factor among many. What's clear is that the lead didn't help. At minimum, it weakened immune systems, clouded judgment, and made the men more vulnerable to scurvy, pneumonia, and tuberculosis. Whether it was the main cause or a contributing factor, those hastily soldered tins added another layer to their doom. Beatty examined fragments of the tins found at Beechy Island. The solder was 90% lead, sloppily applied in thick rivers that ran down inside the cans. Stephen Goldner, the provisioner, had delivered exactly what the Admiralty paid for: the cheapest possible product in the shortest possible time. As for what happened to the expedition's pets, Neptune the dog, the cats, Jacko the monkey, no trace was ever found in the archaeological record. By the 1990s, finding Franklin's ships had become Canada's Arctic white whale. The British had failed with sailing ships and sledges. Canada had side-scan sonar, remotely operated vehicles, GPS navigation. Most importantly, they had something the British had always lacked: respect for Inuit knowledge. Louis Kamukak, an Inuit historian from Gjoa Haven, had spent decades collecting oral histories about the Franklin expedition. The stories had been passed down, remarkably consistent across generations. One ship sank in deep water where the ice pushed it down. The other came close to shore, in a bay where you could see it from land. Men tried to reach it, but died on the way. For over a century, Western explorers had dismissed these accounts. Now, Parks Canada decided to listen. The search became a massive undertaking. Canadian Coast Guard icebreakers, archaeological survey vessels, underwater robots, millions of dollars annually, year after year. They found nothing. The Arctic doesn't surrender its secrets easily. The search area was vast, thousands of square kilometers of seabed. Sonar can only see what it passes directly over. In 2014, they had a new strategy. Instead of searching where logic said the ships should be, near where they were abandoned, they would search exactly where Inuit oral history placed them. September 1st, 2014. The vessel investigator worked a search grid in the eastern portion of Queen Maud Gulf, following coordinates provided by Inuit testimony. On September 2nd, archaeologist Ryan Harris was watching the sonar screen when an impossible image appeared. It came up on the screen plain as day, Harris would later say. You could see the outline of the hull, the deck structures. It was unmistakably a ship, probably the most remarkable moment of my career. HMS Erebus sat upright on the seabed in just 11 meters of water. After 166 years, she was found exactly where the Inuit had always said she would be. The first divers descended within hours. What they found defied expectations. The ship wasn't crushed by ice or broken apart. She sat level on a muddy bottom, largely intact. The stern had been damaged, likely when ice finally pushed her under. Yet the bow remained perfect. Cannon still sat in their positions. The ship's bell was clearly visible. Later dives would reveal extraordinary preservation inside. Plates still sat in racks. Officers' cabins retained their furniture. In the great cabin, where Franklin had died, personal effects lay scattered, but identifiable. The artifacts told stories. A medicine bottle, empty, speaking to the desperate fight against disease. Navigation instruments, abandoned when they became useless. Personal items, buttons, shoes, a hairbrush. No ship's logs, no journals, no written explanation of those final years. What disturbed researchers most was Erebus's location, about 50 kilometers south of where she'd been abandoned. The answer likely lies in the Arctic's powerful ice drift. Pack ice doesn't stay still. It moves with currents and wind. The abandoned ships, still locked in ice, would have drifted for months or years before finally sinking. The Arctic had surrendered one ship. Terror remained hidden. For 2 years after finding Erebus, search teams scoured the ocean floor for Terror. They focused on the area between where the ships were abandoned and where Erebus was found. They found nothing. Then, in 2016, a conversation changed everything. Sammy Kogvik, an Inuit hunter, mentioned to a friend that years ago he'd seen something strange. A thick wooden pole sticking up through the ice, like a ship's mast. The location he described, Terror Bay, was nowhere near the search area. It was in a sheltered inlet where no one expected to find anything. The Arctic Research Foundation vessel Martin Bergman was in the area on other business. They had a few days to spare. Why not check it out? On September 3, 2016, they lowered a small, remotely operated vehicle into Terror Bay. Within minutes, the cameras showed wood, then more wood, then the unmistakable outline of a ship's hull. HMS Terror sat in 24 meters of water. The initial ROV footage showed her 3 masts still standing, the ship sitting upright on the bottom. Adrian Shimnowski, the expedition's operations director, later described the discovery. We came over the deck, and we could see the ship's wheel. It was like a museum. We could see the anchors. Everything was there. Later, more detailed exploration would reveal Terror's extraordinary preservation. Her hatches were battened down, sealed for winter. The ship hadn't been crushed by ice. She'd sunk in deep water, probably when a hull breach finally let the Arctic in. Both ships ended up far from where they were abandoned, carried by the ice drift that moves everything in the Arctic. This raised questions. Did some crew members return? Was Terror winterized by her crew before sinking? The sealed hatches suggested someone had taken care to preserve her. The ongoing exploration of both wrecks has revealed more questions than answers. Terror's sealed condition suggests deliberate winterization. The battened hatches, the organized state visible through portholes. This wasn't a ship abandoned in panic. Erebus tells a different story. Her artifacts are scattered, cabins disrupted. She might have been thrown around by ice before sinking. Between both ships, over 350 artifacts have been recovered, each one a puzzle piece. The ship's bell from Erebus, used to mark time, now marking eternity. Medicine bottles, empty. Their contents long consumed in the fight against scurvy. Plates bearing the Royal Navy broad arrow. Most frustratingly, the crucial written records remain hidden. Somewhere in those wrecks are the ship's logs, Franklin's papers, perhaps even personal journals that could explain those final years. The cold water that preserved the ships also makes diving dangerous. Work proceeds slowly, a few weeks each summer when weather permits. While archaeologists explore the ships, forensic scientists continue analyzing the human remains scattered across King William Island. Modern techniques reveal details the Victorians couldn't imagine. Isotope analysis of bones shows what the men ate in their final months, marine mammals at first, then whatever they could find, finally, each other. DNA analysis has been frustratingly slow. The Arctic preserved bones, yet degraded genetic material. Of the hundreds of bones found, only a handful have yielded usable DNA. When successful, the results are dramatic. Beyond identifying Fitzjames, researchers identified the remains of John Gregory, an engineer aboard Erebus. His bones also showed cut marks consistent with cannibalism. The debate over causes continues. Was it primarily lead poisoning, scurvy, starvation, poor decisions, bad luck? Modern researchers increasingly see it as a cascade failure, multiple factors combining to create disaster. The lead weakened them. The scurvy broke them down. The spoiled food left them malnourished. The wrong route trapped them. The extreme cold finished them. No single villain. No simple answer. Just the Arctic doing what the Arctic does, finding every weakness and exploiting it. The most chilling discovery came from analyzing cut marks on the bones. Dr. Anne Keenly-Side's analysis revealed something deeply disturbing about the cannibalism. In other maritime disasters where cannibalism occurred, there was usually a system. The custom of the sea involved drawing lots, making rational if horrific decisions about who would die to save others. The Franklin expedition showed no such order. Cut marks appeared random, desperate. Some bodies had been efficiently butchered. Others showed hesitation marks, cuts that started then stopped, as if the person holding the knife couldn't bring themselves to continue. Most disturbing, the remains showed evidence of multiple episodes. This wasn't a single desperate moment. The cannibalism had continued for weeks or months as groups of survivors made their slow way across King William Island. The forensic evidence paints a picture of complete social breakdown. Naval discipline, maintained for 2 years in the ice, had shattered entirely. Men no longer traveled in organized groups, but in scattered bands, each making its own desperate choices. Some bodies showed defensive wounds, knife marks on arm bones consistent with trying to ward off attacks. Modern climate science has added another piece to the puzzle. Ice core analysis shows that 1845 to 48 were among the coldest years of the 19th century in the Arctic. The Little Ice Age was reaching its peak, pushing multi-year ice far south of its normal range. Franklin had sailed into the worst possible conditions at the worst possible time. The ice that trapped them off King William Island was fundamentally different from seasonal ice. This was polar pack ice, formed over multiple years, compressed by enormous pressures. No amount of steam power could break through it. Satellite analysis of modern ice patterns shows that Victoria Strait, where Franklin chose to sail, is an ice trap. Currents and winds push massive ice floes into the strait, where they compact and freeze solid. The eastern route Franklin rejected, through Ray Strait, does sometimes clear. If he'd gone east instead of west around King William Island, they might have broken free. Franklin couldn't have known this. He made the best decision with the information available. It was simply the wrong decision. The discovery of the wrecks exactly where oral history placed them marked a profound moment of vindication for Inuit knowledge. For 170 years, Western explorers had dismissed indigenous accounts as unreliable. The British spent millions searching where British logic said to search, ignoring the people who actually lived in the Arctic. Elder Louis Kamukak, who had compiled the oral histories that led to Erebus. Our stories were always true. They just had to listen. The accounts had been remarkably accurate. Not just ship locations, but every detail. Men falling down in the snow, white men with black mouths from scurvy, bodies showing evidence of cannibalism, ships in Queen Maud Gulf and Terror Bay. Every detail the Victorians had rejected proved precisely accurate. Today, Parks Canada's Franklin Research is a true partnership with Inuit communities. Inuit Guardians protect the wreck sites. Inuit Knowledge guides ongoing searches for land sites. The artifacts belong jointly to Canada and Inuit heritage. It's the partnership that should have existed from the beginning. What would have happened if Franklin had asked the Inuit for help in 1847? If Crozier had sought their guidance before the Death March? We'll never know. While the Arctic slowly revealed its secrets, Lady Jane Franklin waged her own battle in London. Born Jane Griffin, she'd been a formidable traveler and intellectual before marrying Franklin in 1828. When he vanished, she transformed herself into a force of nature. She wrote hundreds of letters to anyone with influence. She met with Arctic whalers, gathering intelligence. She consulted clairvoyants who claimed to see Franklin alive. She even commissioned a painting of her husband's triumphant return, a fantasy she clung to for years. Once John Ray brought back the Inuit testimony of cannibalism, Lady Jane revealed her darker nature. She orchestrated a campaign to destroy Ray's reputation. She convinced influential friends to write letters to the Times dismissing his report. She lobbied to have his reward questioned. Most effectively, she enlisted Charles Dickens. His attack on Inuit credibility and household words reached hundreds of thousands of readers. Through sheer force of will, Lady Jane shaped the narrative. Franklin was credited with discovering the Northwest Passage. He hadn't. The men died as heroes. The cannibalism was relegated to unproven rumor. She funded McClintock's 1859 expedition specifically to find a more palatable truth. When he brought back the Victory Point note, but downplayed the cannibalism, she had her vindication. Lady Jane lived until 1875, aged 83, never accepting the true fate of her husband's expedition. Today, some cargo ships navigate parts of the Northwest Passage Franklin died seeking. Climate change is opening routes that were permanently frozen in Franklin's time. The multi-year ice that doomed the expedition is retreating north. Adventure tourists visit Beechy Island, photographing the 3 lonely graves. They sail past King William Island, following the Death March route from the comfort of heated cabins. The wrecks are protected National Historic Sites, jointly managed by Parks Canada and Inuit organizations. Diving is restricted to researchers. The artifacts recovered are displayed in museums, each one a testament to the expedition's slow collapse. Modern Arctic expeditions study Franklin as a cautionary tale. Bring backup systems for your backup systems. Listen to local knowledge. Respect the environment's power to destroy you. The Franklin disaster also demonstrates how prejudice can bury truth. For over a century, racism prevented the British from accepting Inuit testimony. How many other truths do we dismiss because they come from sources we don't respect? The Franklin expedition began with every advantage: the best ships, the most advanced equipment, the backing of the world's greatest empire. It ended with men dragging boats full of silverware toward deaths that came as mercy. Between those extremes lies a very human story of gradual collapse. Not a single dramatic moment, but 1,000 small failures. Lead-contaminated food, useless anti-scurvy measures, the wrong route chosen, leadership dying too soon. Perhaps most haunting is that they almost made it. Some groups reached the mainland. If they'd abandoned the ships earlier, traveled lighter, listened to the Inuit. History turns on such small margins. Today, Franklin's ghost haunts the Arctic in unexpected ways. His name is on islands, straits, and territories. His failure opened the North to exploration. His disaster funded decades of Arctic science. In the end, his greatest legacy might be humility. The Arctic revealed the limits of Victorian confidence, the price of cultural arrogance, the cost of dismissing indigenous wisdom. The ice that took Franklin's men still flows through those straits, waiting for the next expedition that thinks technology can conquer nature. What would you have done in Crozier's place? Standing on King William Island, 105 dying men looking to you for salvation, the ship's ice-locked behind you, hundreds of miles of frozen hell ahead. Would you have made the same desperate choice, or would you have found another way? Let me know in the comments. Today, ships loaded with goods from Asia navigate through Arctic waters Franklin died exploring. Their GPS systems guide them past regions where Terror and Erebus lie beneath the waves. The captains rarely think about the bones scattered on nearby islands, or the desperate men who dragged boats full of Victorian silver across the ice. They have schedules to keep, profits to make. Below the surface, the wrecks wait with their remaining secrets. Each summer, divers descend, hoping to find the logs that will explain those final years. Each summer, they surface with artifacts, but no answers. The Arctic keeps its stories close, releases them slowly, if at all. Franklin sought the Northwest Passage and found instead a frozen grave. His men sought survival and found horrors they couldn't have imagined. The Empire sought heroes and created them by burying the truth. Only the Inuit kept the real story alive, waiting 170 years for someone to finally listen. The Franklin expedition remains the worst disaster in Arctic exploration history, not just for the lives lost, but for the truth denied, the lessons ignored, the wisdom dismissed. For more incredible true accounts of survival, exploration, and the extremes of human endurance, keep watching. There's another story from history waiting for you right here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.